He got in with a very low proportion of the vote. He got in by default because people were unhappy with the Conservatives. It's a disastrous start for his government.
The people have been left in complete shock after Liz Truss, the former Conservative Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, obliterated Keir Starmer, the current Labour Prime Minister, with her usual harsh and brutal criticism.
Because the Starmer government already seems to have hit a few problems. Those cuts to the winter heating payments, plenty of tension on the streets, and now the PM even under fire for accepting free suits from a Labor Party donor. Voters would not be happy. This isn't what they voted for, is it?
No, and he got in with a very low proportion of the vote. He got in by default because people were unhappy with the Conservatives. They voted Labour. They didn't particularly like him.
Now, as many already know, Keir Starmer has recently been under a lot of heat due to the Labour Party policies, especially the budget handling and the energy crisis. Liz Truss added fuel to the fire after she bludgeoned the Labour government and Starmer for their foolish traits, warning the public against the repercussions expected if Keir Starmer remained in power.
He's been caught accepting donations to pay for his wife's dresses. He's been accepting more freebies than any other MP in Parliament. But meanwhile, because of their disastrous economic policies, they are cutting payments to old people, just as energy prices are going up here in the UK. So it's a disastrous start for his government because they came in with no ideas about what they were going to do, apart from saying the Conservatives are evil. That was their only policy.
One major question on everyone's mind is whether Labour should be investing heavily in energy projects while citizens are facing financial hardships. Would you rather have a stable economy or cheaper energy? Let me know what you think.
We in Britain have ended up closing down our oil and gas. This is what's happening under this Labour government. We've just closed our last steelworks, producing virgin steel because energy is unaffordable. The British government is refusing to do fracking, which could make our energy cheaper. And it's a disaster. Our economy is stagnating. Meanwhile, China is selling us solar panels. I mean, why does that make sense? And the problem is we have a Labour Party now in government who are saying that climate change is more of a threat to the future of the world than China. Now, that simply isn't true.
We in Britain have ended up closing down our oil and gas. This is what's happening under this Labour government. We've just closed our last steelworks producing virgin steel because energy is unaffordable. The British government is refusing to do fracking, which could make our energy cheaper, and it's a disaster. Our economy is stagnating. Meanwhile, China is selling us solar panels. I mean, why does that make sense? And the problem is we have a Labour Party now in government who were saying that climate change is more of a threat to the future of the world than China now. That simply isn't true. What's more troublesome for the people is the economy, which has tended to decline continuously following poor policy choices that the government made in response to the financial crisis of 2008, 09, as well as Brexit, the consistently growing inflation marked by the halted productivity growth from the last 15 years, with income per person declining, is not doing any good for the British people in such conditions. Instead of providing public relief, the PM and his party have decided to initiate the Great British Energy Project, which is projected to cost £3 billion of tax money, which is infuriating for the public currently facing an economic crisis.
Your new book, 10 Years to Save the West, you point out that the unelected officials, let's call them the blob if you like, that they can sabotage the policy of an elected government. And why is this the case? Is it because ministers come and go but the officials are there forever? Or is it because too many ministers, elected ministers, just lack the courage to give directions to bureaucrats?
Well, I think the problem in Britain has got much worse, and it got worse during the Blair government because he put in lots of legislation like the Human Rights Act, like the Equality Act, that ended up tying politicians' hands.
Well, Liz Truss also blames her own political party along with the opposition for the current situation, which is certainly true up to an extent.
And we weren't brave enough to take on those ideas when we were in government. So we were boxed in by the Blairite consensus, and that's made it very hard for us to deport illegal immigrants. It's made it very hard for us to put in proper policies on women being women and men being men. And the problem is that in Britain, the bureaucrats' power has grown over time. So more power that used to rest in the hands of MPs now lies in the hands of the Bank of England or the Office of Budget Responsibility or the Migration Advisory Council. And you need a long time to fix those things. And you'll know in a parliamentary democracy like Britain or Australia, it just takes time to get the legislation through, and it takes politicians with courage. And there has been a massive courage deficit on the Conservative side.
The problems in Britain worsened under Blair, whose legislation like the Human Rights and Equality Acts restricted politicians' ability to address key issues like illegal immigration and gender identity. While this situation called for equivalently strong action, the Conservatives failed to deliver it despite sustaining power for 14 years.
Let's go to that vote of the UN overnight. The UK, like Australia, abstained. Yet when I look at the new Foreign Minister David Lammy's recent media focus, I mean, he's put up bisexual pride flags outside the Foreign Office. He gave a great big speech on climate change. Given China, given all the other issues that are on his plate and the growing cultural divisions in the British community, we saw that play out in riots. Surely his focus should be elsewhere.
He's massively out of touch with what normal people in Britain think.
The Labour Party's softer approach towards China, aiming to continue the UK's deliberate strategic ambiguity despite territorial acquisition and regional threats, has amassed significant criticism from the public, while the former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak labelled China as the greatest threat to the UK's economic security. The Labour Party seeks a bilateral relationship with Beijing, landing themselves in a tough situation with the European Union and United States on one side and China on the other. Liz Truss fears the UK won't recover if Keir Starmer and co. stay in power, fueling public protests that show growing discontent with the party's misguided decisions eroding its popularity. But Liz Truss...
He is governing in the interests of that group of people. It's the lawyers in London. It's the people working in the big corporates. It's the civil servants and the bureaucrats. And most people in Britain do not agree with these policies. And this is why this government is already very unpopular. Keir Starmer's ratings have plummeted because they're seen as hypocrites, but they're also seen as representing a very narrow group of people who live in the big cities, who work for the public sector.
Liz Truss fears the UK won't recover if Keir Starmer and co. stay in power, fueling public protests that show growing discontent with the party's misguided decisions.
I get the sense that Britain doesn't think it can get control of its borders again. I mean, can it get its borders back under control?
We can, and we've seen what Australia did. I met Tony Abbott on several occasions talking about his successful policies to get control of immigration in Australia. But there is not the political will to do it in Britain, because we will have to dismantle a lot of our laws, like the Human Rights Act that Tony Blair brought in and Keir Starmer supports. We'll have to dismantle those laws that essentially give more rights to people who are entering our country than people who are living in our country. And the problem is that the political class do not want to acknowledge how bad things are.
However, the political class she mentioned also involves the Conservative Party itself, which just went on housing asylum seekers in hotels, blowing up £22 billion worth of tax money back in 2023, despite promising to handle the matter surrounding the immigrants more proficiently. Moreover, Keir Starmer added fuel to the fire when he cancelled the Rwanda deportation plan for illegal immigrants, calling it dead and buried. Not to mention, with the significant rise of inflatable boats crossing the English Channel, there have been some major catastrophes in the management plans for the British government while planning their budgets and funding. These are just some of the red flags that Liz Truss is raising. Do people really want Starmer in power when all he's done is create one major disaster after another? As if the winter funds blockage wasn't bad enough, he had to follow it up with a slap to the face and more expensive energy bills. Now we have to ask ourselves the hard question: how much longer will Starmer be allowed to drag the UK's reputation and its people through the mud?